Mark. Thank you so much for being here today. We're so grateful to interview you. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Mark Doherty. I'm 68 years old, fortunately retired. I live about 10 months out of the year in LaPaz, Mexico. For you people who've been to Cabo San Lucas, it's about 2 hours north of there. And then, as a matter of fact, I'm heading home. We have a cabin, a small cabin on a small lake in Portland, just west of Portland, Oregon. So I'm heading back for the summer on Monday. So, anyways, thank you for having me, Courtney. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I would love if you could tell us about your book.
Yeah, so my book is titled Reset: How Beating Cancer Ended Decades of Paralyzing Fear and Anxiety. I had a really tough relationship with my father. It started really at kind of an early age. As a matter of fact, out of the mouth of babes, and this is in the book. When I was in the fourth grade, it was coming up for parent-teacher conferences, and we had to write about two things we were afraid of. And one of the things I wrote was I was afraid of my father. And you know, I didn't think about it much at the time. He never did talk to me about it, ironically. My mother said he was embarrassed at parent teachers conference, as I could imagine. So, anyways, it culminated. I had my first panic attack when I was 19 years old. And at the time, I was in the Air Force. I was unsophisticated, I would say. I was 19 years old. I didn't know what was happening to me. I actually thought I was having a nervous breakdown. And anyways, after years of battling it, and we can get into it a little bit deeper, at 48, it ultimately turned into rectal cancer. When I had anxiety, it hit me in my stomach and it would hit me hard. Um, I was probably at my apex. I was probably having anywhere from 10 to 20 legitimate panic attacks a day. And yet, I was a father, I had two kids, I was married, I had some pretty tough jobs. I couldn't just crawl in a hole and feel sorry for myself. I had to pound my way through it. And so that was kind of the purpose of the book. I had been to many barbecues now that I'm retired, and I would sit there and somebody would start whining about their shoulder or this or that. And I go, hey, I got a story for you. And so I shared some of my stuff with these people, and somebody said, you should write a book. And I'm retired. I had the time. So that's what I did.
Amazing. What inspired you to write your book?
It initially started, to be honest with you, it's kind of weird, and that's a great question. Um, we had seven kids in our family. Irish Catholic from Chicago is originally where I'm from. And as it is come out through the years, I think all of us Doherty kids have been damaged to some degree by the relationship with my father. And some of us did better than others, let's say. And I went into the Air Force when I was 17. My birthday's in September. So I was pretty young. I think I shaved maybe twice before I went to service. And then all of a sudden, you're shaving every day. So, anyways, my wife happened to be having knee surgery one time at a hospital in Portland. So I took my laptop with me and I kind of free flowed typed what was going to be a letter to my brothers and sisters, kind of explaining in essence who I was. I left the house so young, and I mean, even though we were all raised together, you realize as you become an adult that you spend so little time with your own family. And so I typed up this letter as kind of a way to explain myself, Courtney, to them, and I wound up not mailing it because I felt like at the end of the day, I asked myself the question, did they really care? And my answer was they probably did. So that was really kind of the beginning of the book, was this letter that wound up being 10 pages. and I just let it sit. I never, and it sat for years. I used Word and I just saved it. I just saved it. And so from there was kind of the beginning of the book.
When you were writing your book, who are you thinking of when it comes to who your book is for?
That's another great question. I think initially I wrote it just because I thought it was an interesting story, as every author probably feels. But at the end of the day, and why I am doing these podcasts is because of how I felt as a male going through this anxiety and fear. I felt really emasculated by this. And, I was born in 1956. I had a father that went to work every day. My mom stayed home. That's kind of how it was back in those days. And you just didn't kind of share too much with people. They weren't very loving. They loved you, but they didn't say a lot to you about it. And so, anyways, ultimately, I realized I needed to get into therapy because I was in bad shape. And thankfully, I was smart enough and maybe humbled enough to decide that I needed to get therapy. And I think at the end of the day, Courtney, that's really kind of my goal is I wanted to put it out there. In my books, I put it all out there in the book. I think when you write a book and you're trying to connect with readers, you have to be honest and you gotta say the good with the bad. And so at the end of the day, what I'm really trying to accomplish is mostly for men to understand that we all have problems. I think it takes more of a man to try to work on them and fix them rather than, I could have easily probably have been an alcoholic or a drug abuser. It's kind of ironic because when I got anxiety, it hit me in the stomach. So I couldn't even really drink a lot before I would get sick, which probably to some degree saved my life, but, or at least saved me from being an alcoholic or a drug abuser. But it was really getting into therapy, opening up, humbling yourself enough, and realizing that you have a problem and that you need to talk.
Amazing. How long have you been writing and what made you really sit down and start?
Um, you know, I, I I've written two books, and I've actually started a third. It's really I find this really interesting, and I'll share this with you. My dad was always he read the newspaper, and I didn't think about this much till after I started writing. But my dad would always write letters to the editor. And he was kind of he wasn't an Archie Bunker, if you remember All in the Family. But he always had an opinion, and he had seven kids he could shout at his opinions to. And so he was always big on writing a letter to the editor. And he maybe got published once or twice. And I remember over the years, I mean, there were points in my life where I didn't talk to my father for 10 years, and the relationship would kind of ebb and flow. And I remember one time when I was in my 50s, and he was living up in Seattle, ironically, and I was in Portland, and he had written a letter to the editor and he got it in the paper. And I remember he cut it out and sent me a copy of it. And I could tell he was so proud. And I've even said to my sister, my older sister, I said, geez, it's kind of a shame dad didn't know how to like type and write because it's so easy now. Like with Kindle, you just type it up, you load it up, you got a book, you know. So, anyways, it wasn't so much that I had this. I didn't grow up thinking, oh, I wanted to be an author and stuff. I felt like my story was pretty unique, and when you read my book, It's kind of divided into three sections, and I just felt it was unique enough and interesting enough. I just thought I would write it. And so that was my first book. And then my second book is titled I'm a Genius, Just Ask Me. And my background is finance. I have an accounting degree. I was usually my work history was really I was the controller of small business. I did do a 4-year stint at Nike, which is headquartered in the Portland area. I was the U.S. payroll manager, but I knew enough about investments to be dangerous, and so after I retired, I had moved my money to a financial person. I wasn't happy with them. Not that they were doing anything wrong, but it's a whole nother thing. And so I decided to just, with a little coaxing from a buddy of mine, decided to manage my own money. And I wound up doing really well. But full disclosure, I made well over $1 million and wound up probably losing half of it at least through just not knowing what I was doing. So, retirement allows me to do it, Courtney. One of the things when you retire and you learn this is you have to fill your time, and you need to find things that are going to fill your time that you enjoy doing that don't cost a lot of money. And whether I'm in Mexico or in the United States, you got a laptop, and I use Word. You can sit there and type whatever you want all day long. So that's really kind of how I got it.
Love that. What is your schedule like when you are writing a book?
That's a good question. I don't. It's all in my head. I don't. I I don't know how authors are. Because I'm the only one I know. But I assume authors do an outline, and they kind of. And what I kind of do, because I don't want to say I think a lot, but I think a lot, and I kind of map it out in my head. For Reset, it was pretty easy because it was very linear. It went from when I was a little boy to today. And so there wasn't a lot of, you read a lot of books and they jump back and forth. I kind of did that with my second book, I'm a Genius. I started out in 2020 during the COVID thing. And for any of your listeners that are in that kind of investment world, the stock market took a dump really quick for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it took off. And so I decided I would open my book up with 2020 when I killed it. Then I went back to when I was a young boy. I remember my dad, and one of the quotes I have in the book is, and I still remember my dad saying this. He said, he's at the dinner table, and he's got 7 kids. He goes, even if you can't put food on the table, he says, you always pay your bills, because if you don't have credit, you don't have anything. And there's these little tidbits in life that all of us kind of latch onto, and that was one of them. So I jump back and forth a little bit in that one, but it's all in my head. And I try to write. I read a lot of nonfiction books, a lot of investment books. I wouldn't say necessarily self-help books, but you can probably classify them as that. And I know what I like. And one of the things I notice about books is the author tries to fill the pages, which with a lot of stuff, let's say, that I don't want to know. And by what I mean by that is they embellish too much, and I'm kind of this get to the point kind of guy. You know, again, if I was a fiction writer, it might be nice to know the scenery. It's kind of funny, and I actually contacted this author. She wrote a book about she was on a mountain trek, and she fell and she got really seriously injured. And her book was like mine in that it had trauma, both medical and mental trauma. But she was this woman was a professional, and as I'm reading her book, it's a nonfiction. As I'm really reading her book, I can see the difference in writing styles from hers and mine. It's like, she would talk about, being in this open field while she's walking, and she's talking about the flowers and the trees and stuff. Like, that's not the kind of writer I am. I try to get to the point because that's how I like to read. I don't, it's funny. I'm an accountant by trade, and you would think I'm a very detail oriented guy. Like, I remember when I saw my when you find out you got cancer, all of a sudden they're throwing all these doctors at you. And so I had my oncologist, and I met with him, and he's like, starts talking about all this process he's going to do, and he says, "Mark, this is your cancer. We're going to do what you want to do." And he's gone on for like 15, 20, 25 minutes about all this. I go, "Doctor, you treat me like you got cancer and you want to get better." I said, "I don't care what you do, just save my life." I'm not like my wife and I remodeled our cabin in Oregon last year, and I said, "Sally, I'll make the payments, you remodel. I don't want to choose the doorknobs. I don't care." So I'm not an overly detailed guy. It'd be interesting. I suppose in my first, well, there's a certain amount, I think, of embellishment in any book, Courtney. You have to pull the reader in, but I don't have a lot of fluff. I think my books, when you go on Kindle, they tell you how long it takes you to read the book. I think mine are like 2.5 hours. I mean, a lot of books I read, they're like 6 to 8 hours. It's like, oh my God. And a lot of times I'm learning the Evelyn Wood speed read. I kind of start flipping when I'm reading stuff that I know I'm not interested in. So,
What do you need in your writing space to help you stay focused?
um, not a lot. I don't, because I'm not what I write nonfiction. So it kind of speaks for itself. It's just really a matter of organizing. When you write fiction, say you're writing a mystery, and maybe this is the difference between them and me, is I'm writing nonfiction, I know the story. It's how do I present it to the reader so that it makes it interesting. When you got when you do fiction, like let's say it's a crime thing, you almost have to sit, I would think, you would almost have to sit down and go from point A to Z and figure the whole thing out with all the twists and the characters and stuff like that. The good news is I'm writing about my favorite subject, Courtney, me. So I know I, I know who the I know who the antagonist and protagonist is. Again, as a nonfiction, it kind of does itself. You don't have to get, let's say, overly creative. I think where you can embellish a little bit, excuse me, is maybe with uh, the detail part of it. Like in my book Reset, I have a section on trauma, mostly dealing with my medical issues, and there's some there's some unbelievable stuff in there, and it's not an easy book to read. As I tell people, it's not an easy book to read, but there's a happy ending. I mean, it was almost like every surgery I had, something else went wrong. I was really messed up for a long time.
What is your favorite writing snack and drink?
Ooh, maybe in the evening, if I would write in the evening, I would maybe have like a alcoholic drink. Like I'm kind of a whiskey and a water guy. But most of the time I would write like in the morning, like when I got up, like I'm a big exerciser. So I exercise in the morning, kind of within an hour after getting up. And again, I'm retired and I know not everybody can do it. Um, but so I would come back and I would write. And in that moment, I would have a lot I wanted to kind of say or get through. Like I would have an idea of I knew where I was at in my story, and I wanted to get from point A to point B, let's say, in that time period. So again, to answer your question, there wasn't anything, I'm not a professional writer, so it's not like I'm pounding through it day in and day out. I would probably write if I really sat down and I could go 2 to 3 hours almost no problem. Mostly just drinking water, getting up, stretching a little bit, because you get and I don't know about other people who write, but my brain gets ahead of my fingers. So I'm feeling sometimes like I got to rush, I will say one of the things I don't know if it's a question you're going to ask, and this was something that kind of had an aha moment when I was writing, is you reread this thing so many times that you get tired of your own story. It's like you almost, because you're looking for mistakes, grammatical or spelling. Does this make sense? Originally I put a bunch of stuff in there, and then I realized maybe it was taking away from the heart of the story. So I kind of struggled with that a little bit, especially with my first book because it was so intense and soul bearing. Uh, the financial one was a little bit easier because it was just numbers the way I looked at it. Where it was far more emotion in the first book. But yeah, you kind of get tired of reading your own story.
What type of books do you personally enjoy reading?
As I've said, I'm a big nonfiction guy, and part of that was driven, Courtney, from my days as a kid. I hated to read, and I remember I was in the seventh or eighth grade, and my English teacher called home. And these were back in the days when if your teacher called home, you were in trouble. And she told my mother that I wasn't reading the book. And it happened to be Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And I remember my mom read me the riot act and said, Mrs. Miller called and she says, you're not doing your homework and da 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 da. And, I will share with you, I didn't turn out into until I didn't turn it into a big reader until later in life. But I remember reading that book. It was a great book. And I was so proud of myself that I read it because I wasn't a reader. But so, anyways, to answer your question, I read nonfiction because because I did it so little growing up. When I read, I wanted to learn something. Like, again, I read because of my background. I read a lot of financial books, how to invest in the stock market, how to accumulate wealth, what to do with it, how to transfer it to your family. We didn't have a lot of money as a family growing up. As a matter of fact, it was funny. I think the most expensive home we lived in when I was a kid was 30,000, and the first home my wife and I bought in Portland was 85,000, and I thought I was a millionaire. It was like, oh my God. And then about 5 years later, we bought a cabin that we now live in Oregon, and the people carried the contract on it, which made it affordable. So here I was, a guy probably at the time, I bet I wasn't making 35,000 a year, with two homes, and I thought I was a zillionaire, you know. So money has always been uh, a thing for me, let's say. I was raised with the idea that the husband went to work, not necessarily because my wife was a teacher. She worked her whole life, but it was like I always saw it as my job to go out and work and to make as much money. And so, not being a big reader, I try to read things that I think are going to help improve my life or improve somebody else's. So, ultimately, to answer your question, big nonfiction. I was going to say something that I think is important for non-authors like I don't consider myself really an author. I tell everybody I'm an international author, but one of the things I think it's important for, let's say, guys like me, people who write one or two books. I hired a gal that I knew to be my editor, and she's a professional writer. We were schoolmates many years ago. It's a long story, but I wound up reconnecting with her. And I paid her $5,000 to help me edit my book. And this was when I was making all this money because I wrote my book in like 2020 when I was making all this money in the stock market. So one of the things I felt was really important, and this is the point of my uh, conversation with you, is that I wanted the book to sound like it came from me. And I have a certain way that I talk. I certainly have a certain sense of humor. And I thought primarily it was going to be bought by people that knew me, which is probably true. I think I've sold 50 copies. And you don't know who buys because they don't tell you that. I would venture to guess 45 of those people know who I am. And every one of them said, and this made me feel good, Courtney. Every one of them said, it felt like you were sitting on the couch talking to me as they were reading my book. And at one point, my editor, I sent her this. I think at the time I had 60 typed up full pages, 12 font of my book. And unbeknownst to me, she started to call me and she was asking me great questions about the book. And I'm writing down these questions. I'm adding to my story, thinking she was just giving me things to think about, which I thought was great. As a professional writer, I thought this is awesome. What it wound up happening was she basically rewrote my book, and she took it from like 60 or 65 pages down to like 40 or 35, 40. And I didn't know she was kind of doing this. So she sent me this copy. She says, read this. I think this is what we should go with. And I was totally put off. And I called her and I said, we didn't disconnect from our relationship, but I said, this is absolutely not going to fly with me. I said, I'll listen, I'll shorten up some of the sections and stuff like that. But my point is, I think as let's say, a nonfiction writer, especially when I was talking about myself. It wasn't like I just read a book on prisoners in isolation in these max. So you got an author coming in and they're interviewing all these people and they put this book together. That's not what my book was about. My book was about me. And I wanted it to sound like it came from me. And so one of the things, and it probably wouldn't have been a question that you were going to ask, but it was really important to me as kind of a novice author that I wanted the book to sound like it came from Mark Doherty. And I believe it did. A lot of people that know me say they found it interesting because they knew who I was. It sounded like me. They could feel my pain based on how I typed. That was really important to me. Thank you for letting me share it. That's I've been on a few podcasts. Nobody's ever asked me that question. And it was important to me to get that out.
I appreciate you sharing that. Are there any books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
No, again, I was not a big reader per se, so I didn't grow up. It always amazes me. I know some pretty sharp people that they can quote sections of books and stuff, or like even like movies. They'll see a movie and they'll almost play the scene out. I'm not that guy. I I glean what I need from it in a broad sense, and then I if I feel like it's something I want to aspire to, then I kind of incorporate it in my thing. I don't have favorite authors most of the time, to be honest with you. Like my wife and I belong to Kindle Unlimited. And so I probably got 3 or 4 I read every day. I read every day. I probably got 3 or 4 books that I'm kind of reading at one time. Usually there's a business one, then there's maybe, like I was reading this one on these prisoners that were in isolation. That was one. And then I'll have like maybe kind of a self-help one kind of going. And depending on my mood and where I'm at, I'll read that. But I would say probably, to be honest with you, 95% of the books I read, I don't even know who wrote them. I look, and this was one of the reasons why, if you look at my book, they kind of have, I'm a big water guy. And so my reset book has the cover, has the clouds in the background. And it just so happened I was standing in the water right at the beach here. Standing in the water, I was reading, and I went out to take a picture, and there was a ray of sun that came and hit my umbrella, and my title was Reset, and I just thought, God, perfect. So for me, I will tell you, when I choose a book, I would say it's first the title, and then it's the cover. It's that simple for me. There's no big, and then occasionally, especially if I'm looking for something specific about investing, I will read the sample. And then when I start reading, if this book is not what I want, I shut it down, I return it to Kindle, and I find somebody else, something else. I'm always on the move. But I don't have any favorites that, I'm not a series reader, that kind of stuff. I'm not that guy. Sorry, but I'm not that
No, no, that's totally fine. And I know you
guy.
mentioned you didn't grow up reading a lot of books, but did you have an all-time favorite as a child that you read?
Well, I remember when I was sick, I got pneumonia when I was a kid, and I was a runner, and I remember reading the Jim Ryan story. And Jim Ryan was a tall, skinny kid like me who broke the 4-minute mile. And I remember reading that, and and then I read Great Expectations. I don't remember reading a lot, but I always remember how good I felt and how proud I was of myself when I finished a book when I was a kid. And then, of course, this was all like from 6th grade to maybe freshman year. It's like when you're in high school, I'm not sure I read any books in high school. I couldn't get out of high school quick enough. But surprisingly, when I was in the 6th grade, I won an award for, we had to write stories, and I got a short story. I got an award for that, and then I was taking an English class, and we had to write a series of poems, and I got like an A+ on writing poems. So I guess I maybe, I haven't thought about this in years. Um, maybe I had a knack for words. I'm certainly a talker, as you could tell. Maybe if I could transfer that onto a page, but I guess I was on. My dad always told me, I had a tough relationship. But he always told me I was a sensitive kid. So maybe this sensitivity came out in writing occasionally, whatever that's worth.
So, Now as an adult, what are your favorite series or authors that you automatically grab? I know you said you don't read series or necessarily have author names. Do you have a typical genre that you read in that you love?
Yes, yeah, definitely. When you go on Kindle, there's kind of subsections. I gravitate probably first of all to Business and Money. I think that's the name of the title. I do like to read bios and memoirs. I would say my reset is really a memoir. It's about my life. And then I'll also look for psychology books, kind of, let's say, a psychology self-help. Um, I'm not a science guy. Um, again, Courtney, for me, it's about learning, and there's specific things I want to learn. Like, I've gotten a couple of these books, like it's like, quantum physics for dummies. And, like I'm trying to expand my horizons, my intellectual horizons. And I can't quite get there. I'm not that interested in it. This may sound kind of self-serving or selfish, but when I read, I either read to help myself personally, emotionally, stability wise, or financially. And financially, we're fine. We're not rich by any means. Like I said, I was rich in 2020 and then I lost half of it. But I live in this casa here in Mexico. We own it outright. We own our cabin in Oregon. So for me to be like debt free, I have some money in the bank. I still trade, I do stock options. So for me, it's about kind of bettering myself with the idea and the hope that I can ultimately better my kids. I have two grown adults. My son has three boys. My daughter actually works for Nike. She doesn't have any kids, but they're both great kids. I think about them all the time. I was in therapy one time, and my therapist said, why do you keep concentrating on money or still investing? You have enough money to be okay. And I said, it's just the way I was raised. It's like you just want to take care of your family, and if I can, I really was gun shy. I never had any help from my folks. Again, I left home at 17. I paid my way through college. I had no student debt. I worked. I would say I'm self-made. But it's nice to be in a position to be able to help your kids if you could do it. And so I like it. It's somewhat of a hobby, but I also want to be good at it.
Love it. What would you tell someone just starting out with reading again?
Boy, I think that there's some life axioms that I try to follow. I'm a real believer in you're the sum of the five people you hang with. I try to keep toxic people out of my life. And probably sometimes people can view me as being a toxic guy. I tell people you don't go through the things that I went through and not come out damaged somehow. So, it's the five people you hang with. The other thing, and I really believe this, and I do it, you should read every day. There's always something to learn. There's always things you can work on personally. I like my son has he has three boys. He has twin baby boys that are 3 years old. I mean, he's running around like a chicken with his head cut off. And I know time is of the essence for him. But I like when I'm around him and I see him sitting on his phone watching TikTok stuff. I said, he's a salesman. And I said, Taylor, there's so many good books on Kindle that you can get that will help you, one, be a better person, help you be a better salesperson. I'm a huge believer in reading. I think if you look at it, Courtney, in life, the way you learn is primarily through reading. When you're a little kid, you learn by experience. Your dad shows you how to use a screwdriver. Your coach shows you how to swing a baseball bat. But like when you go to college, it's all reading, and you don't get your experience until you actually get a job. So you got to learn something, you got to retain it, and then you got to be able to transfer it into something that either makes you happy, earns you money, or both. And so reading to me now, I'm a big advocate for reading. And I remember as a kid, there was always that one or two bookworm in your class, and they weren't good in sports. They always got picked last. And these kids will never know this. But I used to sit there, and I was pretty good in sports as a kid. I would sit there and I would be jealous of them that they had that skill that I didn't have. I Again, the few books that I read when I was a kid, I was always so proud of it because it was something I didn't like to do, but I did it. So yeah,
Love that.
reading's huge for me. As
Cool.
I know you said don't get political. As Trump would say, it's huge. Okay, that's as political as I get.
On the other side
Sorry,
of you're good.
you can edit that, Courtney.
On the other side of that, what would you tell someone just starting to write their own book?
Boy, that's a good question. I would ask him. I would say, okay, and these were all questions that my editor asked me. It's like, okay, so what's the point of the book? What are you trying to accomplish? And then who's going to be your reader? And then how are you going to tell the story? And is it, here's a good question. Is it a story you think people want to hear? And I kind of put that in my introduction in my book. I said, because I really thought, Courtney, was like, as I'm writing this book, because everybody's got a story, everybody's got stuff in their life. And I really thought long and hard, like, does anybody give a shit what happened to me? And I had to answer that question myself. And I thought it was I had my book is about really resilience and pounding through it. I had a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And it was actually cancer that, I don't want to say it cured me, but to this day, if I had not got cancer, I wonder if I would be better. And I paid a heavy price for it. But I did get my life back at almost at 60 years old. And I had my first panic attack, just for purposes of making this math easy, at 20 years old. So 40 years I suffered through this shit, and it was tough. And so I would say to people is decide what it is you want to say, and then as I interrupted you that last time, put it in your own words. Let people feel your pain. Don't gloss over it. Like, my editor was female, and she had a female, I don't know if it was a student or a friend or whatever, read my book too. And they both thought it was too graphic. Then I had a male friend read the book. And I said, during the trauma section, did you think that section was too graphic? And he goes, oh no, I think you needed to say what you said so that people could feel it. So I didn't want to be dissuaded. I want, when you write a book like that and you're sharing yourself, how are you going to get people to empathize with you and feel your pain? And you got to get down into the weeds and expose yourself. And that was one of the big terms that was used constantly in therapy with me is, Mark, you need to be more vulnerable. You need to show and especially I think men in therapy, we tend to not want to show our feelings. And when you write a book, if you want it to be successful, you have to put it out there. And that's probably the biggest thing I would tell. Put it in your own words. Don't over embellish, but let people feel your pains. Obviously, if it's a nonfiction book and you've went through some heavy shit, you need to explain it to people in your own words as best you can. Now, there's some people. I happen to have a college education. I think I'm a pretty good talker slash writer. I've read other authors that kick my ass. No, no, no question. Much better writers than me. But I can express my thoughts. There's some people that aren't that good at it. And that's maybe where an editor can come in if they don't have that self-confidence, come in and kind of help them say what they want to say. And I get that. But I think for somebody who has a story and they want to sit down and tell it, I think absolutely it should be in their voice, with their sense of humor, their fears, their anxieties, their ups, their downs. I think that's what pulls the reader in and makes your book special. And at the end of the day, Courtney, it's all about connection. It's all about communication. I'll share this thing with you really quick before you ask my next question. When I was in college, I went to Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. And at the time, the big company Caterpillar, which I'm sure you've heard of, their headquarters was in Peoria. And we would get the guest accountants. When you become a junior and a senior, they have accountants come to school and they talk to you about accounting stuff. And so we had these guys come to Bradley to talk to the accounting people. And somebody raised their hand and asked this one guy, like, what classes should we take? What level, should we take 500 level auditing classes and stuff? And this guy, and I still remember this, he said, you need to take oral and written communication. He says, if you can't express what you're trying to say, what good are you? And we all looked like, is this guy nuts? He was absolutely right. A book's communicating, a podcast is communication. Your whole life, whether you get married or divorced, it's communication. And most of the time, the issue is the lack of it. And so, again, writing a book is about communicating. And if you're going to communicate and you're going to be honest, you have to put it out there. No shame. No shame. And I bear it all in my book. And some people have said, "Oh, you're so brave and stuff." And it's like, I got to the point, Courtney, where it's like, and maybe it's because I'm 60, I'm almost 68. And I don't mean this in a like my shit doesn't stink way, but I don't really care what people think about me anymore. If you don't like me, if you think this podcast is crappy, don't air it. That's fine with me. I'm sure or like if you read my book, if you think I'm a nut job, that's okay. You bought my book. I got my $5. I'm not going to give it back to you. but there's a certain amount of freedom with that. And again, writing a book is about freedom as well. It gives you an opportunity, especially if it's about yourself, gives you an opportunity to tell your story. It's like, don't hold back. Let them know. Did I
Amazing.
answer your question?
Yes.
And then some.
What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
Certainly in my book, uh, if you mean me personally, well, first of all, I think they're shocked that I was an accountant by trade because I'm out there. I mean, I joke around a lot. As I put in my book, I think I have a good sense of humor. I think humor really got me through a lot of my stuff. Um, I was happy that I had anxiety rather than depression. Although I had my moments of depression, I was never clinically depressed. And I think if I had been through all this and been had depression issues. I don't know that I would have. I had when people read the book, they're shocked at how during the trauma section primarily because it deals primarily with once I got diagnosed and I started having surgeries. I won't share any on the podcast here as I have in some of the other ones, but I was a mess. And I remember my doctor, and this happened when I was in my 50s, so 15, 20 years ago. They told me at that time if what would have happened to me had happened 20 years before I got cancer, I probably would have died. You know, every year something new comes out medically. And that's kind of always the hope with cancer people that have cancer is they're willing to do a lab study that maybe it's a new medicine. I'm losing my term of what it is, but a trial, so that they could stay alive. The goal for them is to stay alive. Um, and when you read my book, there's a lot of like, I would say people would go, "Oh my God, I didn't realize." And what's really interesting is I'm a very healthy guy now. I work out 3 times a week. I do some kind of exercise, and like when I'm fully clothed, you would never know I had these issues. It's not until I take my shirt off. I got some scars here, and then like I have a full time ostomy bag. I don't have a colon. Uh, it's all been yanked out. So I've been pooping in a bag for 15 years now. It's a part of my life. I told the doctor when I got it, I wanted it below my waist because I like to swim and I'm not going to lounge at the pool with a bag of crap hanging over my. And he said it was the lowest stoma he ever put in. Well, I asked them to do it. I knew what I wanted. And there's a lot of those kind of lessons in my books. I share a lot about what I learned through that, which again I think is really important. One of the things and one of the reasons I started doing some of these podcasts, Courtney, was I was my hope was that people would connect with me. I put my email addresses at the end of both books. um, Unfortunately, nobody has. I've talked to some people because I got a big mouth. Um, I'll start talking to somebody in the pool, and I even find myself like, Mark, you got to quit talking about yourself. You know, I feel like I do that too much. But again, I think it's an interesting story to share. People are always kind of enthralled with the you wrote a book. Then I could tell them, yeah, I actually wrote two. And so those are the things, in the book, just and that I made it, I guess. I want people more than anything to say, it's not about feeling sorry for me. It's about making it and being it. I used to tell my doctors, Courtney, I was so fearful that I was gonna die before I made it to retirement. So my goal, and I was able to get out at 61 and a half. Again, I wasn't rich, but my wife was a teacher at Portland. She had retired. She was getting her pension. We had some health benefits through her teachers union that took me to 65 in Medicare. So I was able to get out at 61 and a half, and I was thrilled. At the end of the day, that was my goal. I wanted at least 2 weeks where I didn't have to be anywhere. Just get out of bed. If I could last 2 weeks, I would have considered it a successful retirement. And now here I am. All this happened almost. I had cancer 20 years ago. It never came back. It started to metastasize just a little bit. It got into my lymph nodes. Uh, Really, where my life blew up was 6 years later. I only had a foot and a half of my colon left, and I actually had a bag, so I wasn't even using it. And my doctor wanted to do a colonoscopy, and my colon burst during the colonoscopy, and I was a mess for a long time.
Is there anything you would like to say or add?
Not really. I would say one of the things, I was, because of my issues and who I was, I felt alone in my life. And I think one of the things that got me through it all was this belief in myself. And even to the point where, I knew I could write this book, even though, I didn't have any writing skills per se. I mean, written memos, stuff like that. And, when I was in college, I had to write reports. But, again, it was never a goal to be an author. But, what is an author but just somebody who has something to say? And rather than do 80 million podcasts, write a book, and put it out there and hope people read it. And that's one of the reasons why I do these podcasts. When you go on Kindle and you look for like mental health and cancer, my book's on page 400. You got to spend 8 hours getting to that number. And I asked somebody once. I said, how do I get my book up to the front? They said, you need readers. He said, you ought to consider doing podcasts. And so and I do enjoy them. Again, my goal is to get my message out there and hopefully help somebody. At the end of the day, that's what it's about. The money I make from this is not getting me rich from any means. I think I've made 200 in the last 3 years. The book is, or maybe 2 years. I think I released my first book in 2021. I think I've made $200, and I spent 5,000 with my editor, so I'm way behind the curve. But that's okay. I didn't do it for the money. I did it
Wow.
for the fame. I did it for the fame, Courtney.
Love it.
How's that working for me?
Where's the best place for readers to find your book? I know some readers love signed copies. Is that an option and the best place to connect with you?
The best place to connect, and I don't know, I think I sent you my email addresses. My book, and again, being an unsophisticated author, I didn't look into hard copy books. So my books are on Kindle, Amazon Kindle. Unli- Mine's an unlimited book. So if you belong to Kindle Unlimited, it doesn't cost you anything. You read it and you send it back. I just didn't think, one of the things you got to be real about when you write a book is how many of these are you going to sell? And, I wasn't about to buy 100,000 printed copies of this thing, you know, uh, not knowing who would read them. So I tried to be realistic. It was no, I would actually encourage people if they want to become authors, the easiest way to do it, without promoting them here is the Kindle Direct Publishing. There may be others out there. I'm not aware of them. I took the path of least resistance. I had my own. I did everything. And actually, one of the things that was kind of nice in my second book, Kindle chose me to allow me to do the AI audio, which was really kind of neat because I have some friends that said, I'm not a reader, but I drive a lot. I listen to audiobooks all the time. So I think my second book is actually an audiobook, and they give you like 10 voices and you get to choose one. And it actually, I listened for about, 5 or 6 pages. Maybe the inflection is not perfect, but there's some feeling in the AI guy reading it, and so. But anyways, it's on Kindle. It's reset, and I'm a Genius by Mark Doherty. Um, and encourage your listeners to download it, read it, and I'm always happy. Again, I'm an open book. I'm happy people can contact me. I'm happy to talk.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We're so grateful we got to interview you. We'll be sure to put those links in the show notes. That way everyone can connect with you. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney. It was my pleasure.